Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of the store, along with my wife, Lisa Muscatine, and we're delighted to have with us this afternoon historian Lindsay Chervinsky, who's here to talk about her new book, Making the Presidency, John Adams and the Precedents That Forged the Republic. Talk about good timing, right? There's a lot of interest these days in vice presidents becoming presidents. And the first U.S. vice president to make that leap was, of course, John Adams. As Lindsay recounts in her timely book, Adams had a lot to learn, and fast. Although he'd been a practicing attorney, delegate to the Continental Congress, a representative at the Confederation Congress, a diplomat, and vice president, he'd never held an executive position. Further, the institutions of government were at that time still in their infancy. Adams was able in 1796 to defeat Jefferson by a very narrow margin in what was the first contested presidential election. Then he took office in what was the first transfer of executive power in U.S. history. He faced all kinds of challenges. Domestically, he was confronted with intense partisan division and an inherited cabinet that was often at odds with his own political aims. Abroad, he had to deal with the prospect of a possible war with France. Lindsay credits Adams with managing these challenges ably and demonstrating that someone other than the widely respected George Washington could actually be president. And in the process, Adams established, as Lindsay shows, the parameters of the presidency. She writes, Washington created the presidency, but Adams defined it. In a rematch against Jefferson in 1800, Adams lost and stepped down with no fuss. Power passed peacefully, no blood was shed, partisans and foreign actors did not tamper with votes. There's clearly a lesson in that. In researching and writing the book, Lindsay brought a deep familiarity already with the function and machinations of early presidential cabinets. She's executive director of Washington's Library at Mount Vernon, and her previous book 4 years ago focused on the creation of Washington's cabinet. As Lindsay notes, biographies of Adams have tended to give short shrift to his presidential years. Making the Presidency fills that gap and is, as a review in Kirkus said, quote, a significant contribution to the history of the American presidency. Overall, as another reviewer said, the book portrays Adams, who was famously irascible, stubborn, and quixotic, as nonetheless a sympathetic character determined to be his own man and create his own legacy. In conversation with Lindsay, we're very fortunate also to have journalist Peter Baker, who himself knows a thing or two about U.S. presidents. He's covered 5 of them so far, first for the Washington Post and in more recent years as chief White House correspondent for the New York Times. He's also written several great books involving presidents, one on Bill Clinton's impeachment, another on George W. Bush and Dick Cheney, and yet another on Barack Obama. And with his wife, Susan Glasser, he's co-written books on Vladimir Putin's early years in power, James Baker's life, and Donald Trump's presidency. So please join me in welcoming Lindsay Chervinsky and Peter Baker.
All right, thank you, Brad. Appreciate that. Thank you guys for coming. How's everybody doing today? Everybody good? All right. Well, I'm so delighted to be here with Lindsay Chervinsky today. I have to say, this is a great treat for me. She's one of our real up-and-coming historians, and I think you're going to see a lot of her in the years to come. You know, she is the Doris Kearns Goodwin of her generation, I think, in the making, and you're going to be reading a lot of her books, I think, over the years. She, as Brad just said, she comes to us as the newly appointed executive director of the George Washington Presidential Library down in Mount Vernon, and she's the author of The Cabinet, as Brad said, and an editor of a book called Mourning the President's Loss and Legacy in American Culture. Her work appears in publications, including the Wall Street Journal. Just the other day, she gave us a great list of 5 presidential biographies you might want to check out. But most of all, I think, most important to me anyway, she is the companion of John Quincy Adams, or Quincy as she calls her great dog. And you may be able to see this. I'm not sure if you can see this from here, but Quincy loves presidential sites, including Mount Vernon, where apparently he visits fairly often, right?
He does, yes.
Lindsay, thank you for being with us today. Really appreciate that. Tell us, as Brad says, John Adams is really timely today for a lot of reasons, but I actually think he's timely all the time in a way. He is really such a fascinating figure. He's overlooked by the Washington, or overshadowed by the Washingtons and Jeffersons, but in some ways he is the heart and soul of the American Revolution. He was, in effect, the personnel director of the Revolution, right? He advances Washington as the commander-in-chief and Jefferson as the architect of the Declaration of Independence. And then, of course, his presidency is actually more interesting, as you rightly put it, than people have given it credit for. And yet, and to me, though, the most important contribution is that passage of power, right? The very first time in our history, and one of the few times in world history, that somebody with absolute power in a country gives it up because the other guy won, right? And we take it, we took that for granted for a long time. We don't anymore, I think. But what an extraordinary precedent he set. So tell us a little bit about why you decided to write about him now, and what when you say that he defined the presidency as opposed to Washington, who started it. What did you mean?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for being here with me today. Thank you all for being here. This is such a lovely turnout. I was supposed to have an event here 4 years ago for my first book, and it came out 3 weeks into the pandemic. And so that obviously did not happen. So it is so fun to actually have this experience. And I can think of no one better to have this conversation with, given that I have all of your books on my shelf. And I was actually supposed to bring them to have him sign them, and that slipped my mind. You can't hear over there? Okay. Is that better? No?
Just hold it really close like that.
Okay. Hopefully I won't smack myself in the face with it. You did such a great job laying out sort of some of the big contributions that Adams makes and why they matter so much. And I was always thinking about writing a John Adams book. After I finished the book on Washington, I started to have this question about, okay, so he created this thing. And then what happens next? You know, it's great to establish a model that's a very good one. But if no one repeats it, then it's just a really interesting historical anomaly. And as we've both discussed, Washington was such an unusual figure in American history because he was so unparalleled in his stature. We've never seen anyone like it in American politics since him, and I would wager that we never would again. Maybe Dolly Parton, but that's about as close, not in politics anyway. And so how is the presidency going to work for someone who doesn't have that kind of stature? And that was really initially my motivating question. And then January 6th happened. And I realized how much I was taking for granted, the peaceful transfer of power, how much I had not really thought through the fragility of our institutions, which sounds a little ridiculous given that I've spent many years studying them. And it caused me to look at Adams' presidency in a new way, to start to ask, okay, well, where did this practice start? How was it created? How did Americans learn to cherish it as a really important part of our democracy? And that really started with John Adams. And so I felt like that story had to be told in this moment as we are grappling with, do we care about having a democracy? Do we want to have these institutions? Do they matter to us today? And if so, what do we have to do to try and ensure their ongoing survival?
Well, tell us a little bit about Adams himself as a personality. We in some ways, we actually know more about him than a lot of the founders because he was a prolific letter writer. Many of these letters have been saved, particularly letters to his wife, of course, are epic. But as Brad says, he's thought of as kind of irascible. I think that was the word you used, vain, kind of contentious, right? He had feuds with the members, not just the other side of the aisle, but his own side of the aisle. But you come to like him more, right? You come to find the lovable John Adams.
Yeah, I think John Adams is really actually quite delightful. It's impossible to spend a lot of time in his letters and not come away with a sense of his keen awareness of his own failings. He was very self-deprecating. He made fun of himself all of the time. He was whip smart. He adored his wife and critically respected her, which is always a nice thing to find in the letters. He is, in many ways, a much more accessible founder to us today and a much more likable founder to us today than some of the others. But the things that make him accessible in this moment sometimes made him an anathema to his contemporaries because he didn't have the same sort of like steely reserve that Washington had, and he didn't have the military experience. And so sometimes I think that they thought he was a little bit nuts. But what I realized as I was reading through his letters and all these other sources is so much of the story that we have about John Adams is basically copied and pasted from letters that Hamilton and Jefferson were writing at the time while they were competing against him in campaigns. And Hamilton and Jefferson are two of the all-time greatest propagandists that Americans have ever produced. Doesn't mean they weren't brilliant, but sometimes they were full of it. Or they were extremely motivated by partisan aims. And so typically historians, when they're assessing Jefferson and Hamilton's words, they take them with a grain of salt, or in some cases, appropriately, a bucket of salt. And yet when it comes to Adams' descriptions, historians like take them at face value. So like, for example,
he lost the public relations historical war.
He did. Yeah. He did not have a party that kind of could defend his legacy because the Federalist Party really became synonymous with Hamilton. But so like, let me give you an example. One of the common tropes about Adams is that he could not control himself. He would fly off the handle all of the time. Sometimes that was true, especially with Hamilton, because Hamilton just pushed all of his buttons. But he also knew that he tended to be a hothead. And so when he was responding to letters, he would write up to 4 drafts to make sure that he was getting to the core of the issue and not allowing his emotions to take over. And he would write on the first 3, do not send. And then finally send the one that was a little bit more, moderate. And so I think that...
So John Adams would not have done well in the Twitter era.
He would have had to have like a lock after, he would have to like have multiple levels of security to make sure he wasn't responding rashly.
That's actually a trick of many of our best presidents, right? Lincoln, Truman, they all wrote these letters that were angry and tempestuous, and they put them in a drawer and they waited to decide whether to send it. And for the most part, they were of wiser minds than some of their other contemporaries.
Yes, and we can, take a good lesson from this. We should never send the angry email. It's the version of, you write the email and then you sleep on it and you see how you feel in the morning. And Adams was actually really good at that. And so his personality is, I think, I found him to be extremely lovable and in a lot of ways extremely admirable, especially because of his awareness, I think, of his own limitations. That's a quality that I think, as you said, some of the best presidents have had. And that awareness is essential if you're going to be in a position of such incredible power and have to make decisions. To know when you really need help is critical.
Yeah. I think he has with the passage of time, there's the reminder that he was a principled man as well, in a way that stands out actually from the founders. As much as we may admire Washington and Jefferson, basically Adams is the only of the first 5 or 6 presidents who didn't own slaves, wasn't a slave owner, didn't believe in slavery, thought slavery was an evil that the country would have to confront someday. Although it wasn't something he took on himself, he at least historically was on the right side of that debate, whereas his rivals were not for the most part.
Yeah, so he and his son were the only of the first, I haven't actually counted up to what number, but of the first several to not own any enslaved individuals. That doesn't mean that they necessarily shared our racial ideas. Slavery was incredibly complicated in the 1790s. And so, for example, when he was vice president and he would go to the president's house multiple times per week to attend social engagements that Washington was hosting, an enslaved person would have taken his coat or would have brought him a beverage. And so he was benefiting from this system, even if he wasn't financially engaged. However, and I think a lot of Adams and Abigail and their family's objection was in some ways like a political one. They objected to the additional power that the South received from the 3/5 clause for representation. But they also had a real moral objection to it. They felt like it degraded both the person that was enslaved and the person that was doing the enslaving. And they were pretty vocal about that.
Now, you talk about Hamilton. Hamilton, of course, Adams will probably never have a great Broadway show made about him, but Hamilton was the puppet master behind the scenes when it came to Adams' own cabinet, right? Adams keeps, as I think Brad alluded to, he keeps Washington's cabinet, but may or may not have realized how much they were really doing Hamilton's bidding. How much, I mean, it's a really dramatic thing to think about, right? A president who is fighting with his own cabinet, not realizing that his rival is the one pulling the strings. How much did he really not know? Why did he keep them in the first place? Having written the book about the formation of the cabinet,
Yeah.
This is a really important moment.
It's a great question. So there was no precedent of cabinet secretaries giving their pro forma resignation when a new president came in. And based on Adams' example, a lot of presidents have really learned the lesson that you really don't want to keep your predecessor's cabinet. You have to have your own advisors. But that example was not in place. And at the state level, there wasn't that example. And so Adams was going based off of a couple of factors. One, he knew that Washington had had a really hard time filling cabinet vacancies. They were not particularly prestigious positions. They were not paid very well. Travel was absolutely terrible. And so you were going to be away from your family for months and months at a time. The job was really onerous. And so Adams figured if Washington had trouble filling these positions, then he was going to as well. He also worried that if he replaced them, it might be seen as a rebuke of Washington's judgment, and that was not something he wanted to mess with as he was engaging in this transition. And the third reason was, we tend to forget this, but the transition of 1796 to 97 was really, really stressful for people living through it. They didn't know what was coming next, so they didn't know that the election of 1800 was much more dramatic. And instead, what they knew is that the most recent transition they had seen was the French Revolution, which was characterized by guillotines and blood in the streets. And so that is the model they're trying to avoid. And so Adams, knowing that Americans were nervous about this, thought keeping the cabinet secretaries would be useful because it would be a way to have some institutional knowledge and some stability. And critically, Washington didn't tell him not to. Now, Washington knew that some of these secretaries were really not up to the task. He knew that they were not capable of the demands of the job, or they were sort of dispositionally very, very poorly suited to their particular position, and he didn't say anything. So to your point about how much did he know, initially he had no idea that most of them were much more loyal to Hamilton and were really sort of, going exactly along with whatever Hamilton's plan was, up to the point where they would ask him for advice and he would send a letter and they would copy whole segments from his letter into their advice to John Adams. Adams didn't know this initially. When it eventually became clear, he did start to distance himself from the cabinet and ultimately did remove some of the secretaries, but it took a really long time.
Now, you mentioned the French Revolution. I think for those who might not have read recently on John Adams, it may be a surprise how much that dominated his presidency, dominates your book, and how he is balancing the war fever, if you will, among the Federalists and then the French sympathizers on the other side, led by Jefferson. And he is willing to have a navy but not an army. And there's Hamilton again manipulating the situation to give himself an army with Washington as the figurehead. This is the dominant issue at that time. We come close to a war. They call it the Quasi-War, right? Quasi-War. Tell us a little bit more about how he managed that, especially because in the end we didn't go to war.
Yeah, it absolutely is the dominant issue. So a little bit of context. So in 1776, when the United States declare independence, in 1778, the United States signs a bunch of treaties with France, and France becomes the big ally in the revolution. Several years later, in Washington's presidency, he signed a treaty with Great Britain called the Jay Treaty, and France was very annoyed about this treaty because they felt like it kind of took away some of their special status and started to seize American ships and imprison the sailors on the ships, sell off all the goods, and keep the ships for themselves as sort of retaliation for this treaty. And obviously that was a very unpopular thing to do. A lot of Americans were not particularly happy about that. And so this was all kind of coming to a head as John Adams was coming into the presidency. And you're right, the French Revolution was really important context because Americans really did see themselves as citizens of a global community. They were not stuck in their own little bubbles. They were not hiding behind the Atlantic Ocean. They were paying close attention to what was happening in Europe and very aware that republics were quite fragile and could fall apart and could lead to multiple different conventions and constitutions, which is what had happened in France. That was the outcome they were trying to avoid. So when Adams came into office, he was trying to pursue diplomacy, recognizing that war was not going to be beneficial for the United States. It was going to be probably very expensive. It was going to be very costly in terms of blood and lives and treasure. And not to mention, the United States didn't really have much of an army or navy anyway. So even if they had wanted to fight, they didn't really have anything with which to fight. So one of the first things that he encouraged Congress to do, he had been going on and on for years about we need a navy. We have to have a navy. A navy is a good defensive mechanism. A navy is very beneficial for trade. And if there is a war, you kind of need something to try and defend the coasts. Congress did eventually pass a navy. He was delighted by this. Congress also greatly expanded the army. He was less excited about that because the army became very political.
The part of this whole context, of course, is really the origin of the two-party system as we know it today. Not exactly, obviously, the same two parties, not exactly the same ideological split, but really the beginning of the idea that there would be two large factions in America, which the founders didn't think was a good idea. And this leads to, this question, which we're kind of revisiting today, about the limits of free speech and immigration. And probably the darkest spots on Adams' record, right, would be the Alien and Sedition Act. Why did he, tell us a little bit about them, and why did he do those? And what did he ever regret them?
Yeah, it's definitely the darkest part in Adams' presidency, and it has to be grappled with. So there were these two parties. There was the Federalist Party, and then there was what they called the Republican Party. But it should not be confused with the Party of Lincoln or the Republican Party today. So these were the two parties. The Republicans tended to get a lot of their support from immigrants, from the working class. They tended to have support in the Western regions, and they tended to be a little bit more pro-France, and the Federalists were a little bit more pro-British. The Federalists also tended to have more support in the North, in urban spaces. They were more pro-trade. So that was kind of roughly the two divisions between the parties. Some of the things that they were grappling with at the time will sound really familiar. How to handle pandemics, citizenship, immigration, xenophobia, who counts as a citizen, what is free speech, how much of it is a good idea, foreign interference in elections, contested elections, political violence. So the 1790s are incredibly relevant to us today, I think, and I hope you will agree. So in terms of the Alien and Sedition Acts, when there was this threat of war with France, they created the army, they created the navy, and one of the things that they also did was to try and address, in theory, the threat of political violence. There was a sense that all of these immigrants were coming in. They were extremely radical. They were making political life more radical at the time. And there was not the same sort of restrictions that we have today about what sort of free speech was permitted in print or orally. So like, for example, the most common example today is that you cannot shout fire in a crowded theater. You don't have a right to have protected speech that incites violence. These are things that we accept as limitations. None of those were really on the books, and editors were just printing lies in the newspaper that were actually calling for violence. So I think there was that good faith concern and a genuine fear of what that speech could do because they were seeing political violence around them. But then the Federalists took that and pursued it to very partisan aims. So the Federalists in Congress passed 4 bills 2 alien bills, a naturalization bill that made it much harder to become a citizen, and the Sedition bill. Critically, John Adams did not ask for any of them. He did not try and whip votes or count noses for any of them, but he did sign them. Now, one glimmer of light that I think is really important is one of the alien bills did give him the authority to deport any foreign national at will without due process. He never used it. He did not use that bill. So I think that that does show some good judgment or recognition that this bill was way too extreme. The Sedition bill, however, basically made it a crime to criticize the president or Congress. It notably left out the vice president, who was Thomas Jefferson, which was very intentional. And it expired the last day of Adams' presidency. Also very intentional. Adams was not in charge of overseeing these prosecutions, but he did actually encourage some of them, and that has to be included in his legacy. I think that at the moment he genuinely did fear political violence and thought that this might kind of tamp down some of that, those motivations. And later, I do think he never said, to my knowledge, that he regretted it, but a lot of his later nominations were people who had been vocally opposed to the Sedition Act, which leads me to believe he was starting to sort of rethink some of those ramifications.
And it really is amazing how, we talk about history rhyming or whatever the phrase is. I mean, it's extraordinary. We're still talking about deportations today in a political context. And we're talking about what are the limits of publishing things that are flatly not true while not trying to impose limits on a free society. I mean, Facebook, in effect, and the other social media, organs are the 250-year later manifestation of what they were talking about at the time, right? I mean, it's really quite striking.
Yeah, I mean, the media ecosystem in a lot of ways looks incredibly similar to what we have today. They didn't have social media, but they had the concept of having incredibly partisan press was something that they had. I think there's one key difference. In the 1790s, everyone understood that most of the press was partisan. They understood which newspapers were kind of trying to play it right down the middle and the straight and narrow, but they understood if they were reading a Republican newspaper or a Federalist newspaper. I think the challenge today is that a lot of people are still operating under the mindset that came about in the turn into the 20th century of a journalistic ethos. It used to be that most journalists were committed to pursuing the truth and trying to share that with their readers. Were not motivated by a partisan agenda. And I think there are, obviously, I'm sitting next to one of them, there are still journalists who want to do that today, but there are a lot who don't. And I think the problem is actually one of citizens' media literacy, that we don't always know which one of those we're reading. We don't always know if we're reading a partisan newspaper or a truly journalistic newspaper. And so I think that's the key difference with the 1790s.
We're going to open up for questions in just a couple of minutes, so get your questions ready. It is interesting reading through your book how many echoes that you see today, and you don't dwell on it too much in your book. Your book is not meant to be drawing out those comparisons, and yet they're there. They are, and you just talked about one of them. The other one that really struck me was, of course, the election of 1800. And again, we think of today, some of the things that are happening today as unique and unprecedented, and in many ways they are, but there are some parallels in some ways and precedents. Tell us about the election of 1800 and the potential political use of violence to achieve or secure power.
So the election of 1800 was an absolute mess, and they knew it was an absolute mess, and I think is actually incredibly instructive for our current moment. So voting started in October. The voting ended on December 3rd. So if we think we have to wait a really long time for results, they would love the rapidness of our elections. When all of the votes were brought in on December 3rd, it was clear that Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, the two Republican candidates, had tied at 73 votes apiece, which meant that under the terms of the Constitution, it would go to the House of Representatives. However, those votes were not going to be certified until February 11th. So that meant there were 2 months for people to get up to all kinds of shenanigans, and they did. The Federalists, in particular, tried to brainstorm ways that they could prevent Jefferson from becoming president. The most obvious one was to try and get enough people to support Burr, who they felt would be more malleable for them and maybe help them pursue their goals. Some of the other more unorthodox options were to try and delay the outcome until past March 4th, so there would have to be a new election, or potentially appointing a temporary president who could then run as an incumbent. These were all sort of extra constitutional ideas that they were toying around with, but because this was a new, unprecedented situation, there was space for them to be considering these things. And the Republicans were thinking about how to counter those ideas. So when we think about political violence, that was very central to really both sides' configurations of how to manage this situation. And as Congress gathered in the winter of 1801, so January 1801, a large mob gathered outside of the Capitol and threatened to kill anyone who put someone other than Jefferson in the presidency.
Did they chant, "Hang John Adams"?
Not in so many words, but close enough.
Right.
And, the French minister who was in the city said there was 100,000 people outside the Capitol. Now, the city did not hold 100,000 people. He was exaggerating slightly, but I think it reflects the mentality, the concern, the fear. And so there was this mob outside the Capitol. At the same time, the governor of Virginia and the governor of Pennsylvania, both Republicans, had their militias ready on the borders of the state to march into D.C. if the Federalists got up to no good. And Jefferson at various points said, well, if we can't come to a resolution, maybe we'll have to call a new convention and come up with a new constitution, which was not an explicit threat of violence, but was a very clear nod to what had happened in France, that when you have multiple constitutions and multiple conventions, it can go quite badly. And all of those threats were lingering as the House started to cast their ballots, and they went through one ballot and another ballot and another ballot, and they were all deadlocked. And it took until the 36th ballot where they were finally able to elect Jefferson. And what the lesson I think is really important for us is what actually finally broke the logjam were a couple of congressmen who were in their 30s and 40s putting the good of the Constitution, their survival of the Constitution, above their own political aims, which is what I define as civic virtue. They basically said, we don't care if our party loses, we are going to make a compromise and make this work. And that is hopefully the lesson people will take from the election of 1800.
So we had a mob threatening the Capitol as we were trying to decide the presidency of the United States. And we had the question of whether people would put country before party. That's extraordinary, right? Do you come, and of course, this is the House voting on, this is what they call a contingent election, right? Yes. Which means that because we couldn't get a majority in the Electoral College. And then, of course, then there's a certification in which the vice president presides, right? Who was the vice president then?
So the vice president at the time was Thomas Jefferson. He was presiding over the certification of this contested election in which he and Aaron Burr were tied. And he did not change the outcome. So that's another interesting historical parallel.
But the Trump people, not to bring his name into it, sorry, but the Trump people actually said, well, Jefferson did that as vice president, therefore Mike Pence can do that. They used that argument in their conversations with Pence where they tried to convince him to tilt the election in 2020, in January of 2021. What really happened?
Yeah, so that argument was put forward by, there are a number of lawyers in the crowd, and I apologize in advance. Married to one, daughter of one, sister of one, love them dearly. One of the lawyers in particular got a hold of this argument and didn't actually really read the documents. This is why the Constitution has to belong to all of us and not just lawyers. So one law professor got a hold of this, and he said, well, Jefferson changed the Georgia votes. But that's not actually what happened. Georgia, the way that the votes were certified at the time is the state would send in their official certification of their state votes in a sealed envelope. Georgia sent in the official certification, but also wrote on the outside of the envelope the results. Jefferson realized that they had done both, sent the unofficial tally and the official tally. And he, before there could be any question about whether there was a difference between the two, which there was not, he said, these are the Georgia votes, and they moved forward. So he did not in any way change the outcome. He did not in any way change the Georgia certification. He was recognizing that they had sort of done multiple reportings rather than, dual slates of electors. And he was saying, this is the result, we're moving forward. So he did not in any way change the outcome. He does not establish a precedent that the vice president can do so. That position has always been sort of ministerial as opposed to actually having a role.
Yeah, I actually I did an interview with Trump in which he raised this as an example wrongly of how they could have done things differently. But speaking of those resisting the transfer of power, Adams at this point is not even really a player. He's not one of the top two contestants. He's not even a consideration for being president in this next term. But he is required at this point to, in effect, turn over the White House. In fact, he's just moved into the White House. They had just opened it for the first time. He moved in only a few months before he had to leave it. Did he ever have any second thoughts about that? Was that something he actually debated in his mind, or was it always clear to him he had no choice? He was going to give up power and set this extraordinary precedent.
This is where I think Adams is actually at his best. So while all of these debates are happening, while there's questions about whether or not there's going to be violence, there are also questions about what is a president who has lost supposed to do? And he looked at the Constitution and he said, I have no role in deciding the outcome of this election. I'm going to stay out of it, which is exhibiting restraint. Now, restraint is far less sexy than winning a civil war. It is far less splashy than winning World War II. It's not the type of thing that usually gets you a monument, which is one of the reasons John Adams does not have a monument in downtown DC. And the library building at the Library of Congress does not count. But he stayed out of it. But he also set the terms for what the transition would be once there was actually a transition. He invited Jefferson over to the White House so he could meet with some of the staff. He could see what the building looked like. They could have a conversation in which Adams said, I believe that you are supposed to be the rightful president. I believe that will be the outcome. Abigail sent him a number of details about sort of the running of the House. He sent updates to Jefferson about what was in the stables so he didn't have to buy additional horses and carriages. After the House did make a decision, he instructed his cabinet secretaries to cooperate with Jefferson, to basically give him updates on the state of the departments, or what we would think of today as sort of briefings on national intelligence, long before any of that was required or written down. And then critically, he went home. And he never questioned whether that was the right thing to do. And when he got home, he sent Jefferson a letter saying, everything is looking good here. I wish you a peaceful and successful administration. So he set the term for what it means to lose and go home.
That's a great lesson here. We should take it at that point and move it on to questions from the audience. We have a microphone right here. Please ask your question here at the microphone so they can catch you on the recording. And of course, if we could make sure to keep it a question rather than a statement, that would be even better.
Three items. Number one, I'm sorry, I've read McCullough's book. I haven't read your book yet, so I'm going before.
It's okay, it just came out 2 days ago. That would be quite an achievement.
Is it basically true that following the Boston Massacre, Adams set the standard for legal process?
Yes. So Adams took on this case and demonstrated a tendency to do what he thought was right, even if it was unpopular. He was sort of obstinate when he felt he was in the right, because he wanted it to be clear that the colonies were building a tradition that was based on the rule of law and not passion of the mob.
Okay. Number two, if I'm not mistaken, Adams wrote one of the first state constitutions, and it was sort of the model for other state constitutions. Now, a question I would have, each state was sort of like a colony for the first 7 or 8 years. Did the writing of those state or the model constitution for Massachusetts have anything to do, was it detrimental in as much as other states picked up constitutions and were their own colony, so to speak, until about 1786?
So he wrote the 1780 Massachusetts state constitution. At that point, most states had cycled through several constitutions because their initial attempts in 1775 and 1776 were extraordinarily radical and often quite unproductive. And so around 1780, a lot of these states were sort of coming into their second version. John Adams wrote the Massachusetts version. It was one of the models for the United States Constitution. Fun fact, this is a good trivia fact if it ever comes up. The Massachusetts State Constitution is the longest surviving written constitution in the world.
Okay. Finally, the last question. My favorite musical is 1776. And it would definitely portray Adams as the agitator who made it happen. To what degree you think that's true?
Oh, he was definitely an agitator. As Peter said at the beginning, he was instrumental he pushed, cajoled, dragged, nagged, whatever it was to get people to agree to independence. He was instrumental in getting Washington appointed as commander-in-chief. He ensured that Jefferson would be the drafter of the Declaration of Independence. So one might say he was really quite central to the entire thing taking off.
So 1776 is not that far off.
Well, you can be an agitator and also be very important.
Well, I mean, the musical 1776.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you for your questions.
Thank you very much for being here today. My name is Nathan, and I'm a recent graduate of Montgomery College here in the Washington, D.C. area. I'm ultimately hoping to study education and to teach American history. I've had an interest in American history, and particularly the Revolutionary era, for a very long time. My question is, I was reading what you wrote about a slave rebellion that Gabriel, an enslaved individual in Virginia, led, and I was wondering if you would be able to speak some about Gabriel's rebellion. And also, I read that John and Abigail Adams did not comment publicly on the revolt. I was wondering if they expressed private opinions, or if you have any indication as to what their opinions might have been.
Yes, so Gabriel's revolt took place in the fall of 1800. It was in Virginia. It was one of the largest enslaved uprisings really up until the Civil War. It was incredibly well organized. It spread out across the state from Richmond to Norfolk to a bunch of the other large cities. It had people from plantations and into the cities. They had built, many of the people who were central to organizing it had really exceptional blacksmith skills, so they had made their own weapons. And it would have been much more successful if not for a freak thunderstorm that basically flooded the roads and made it impossible for people from the outlying plantations to come into the city. Virginia responded with an incredibly violent crackdown, and it led to a lot of the shifting of discussion about abolition in Virginia and shifting of laws around emancipation in Virginia as well. The Adamses did not comment publicly on it. It was seen as a state issue. However, privately, the family kind of said that they felt that some Virginians were getting their just desserts.
Hi, Dr. Chervinsky. Congrats on your book, and
Thank you.
And thank you so much for your scholarship. I think all of us are trying to extrapolate a lot of the lessons from John Adams to today, right? I mean, you said that the timing of your book is not necessarily coincidental or accidental, that we're all trying to glean lessons about the transfer of power, about humility, about the rule of law. One topic that I can't wrap my head around from the 1790s and the election of 1800 and extrapolate it through today is the role of the Supreme Court. And so Marbury versus Madison was 1803, right? A couple years after the election, and the whole doctrine of judicial review and the role of the court. Now in 2024, when we think about this election and we think about the court, it's taken on a very different set of dynamics. John Adams was a lawyer by training, Harvard, believed in the rule of law. From your research and scholarship, how do you think he would help us process the role of the federal judiciary and the role of the Supreme Court in today's times?
It's a really good and
And try
very,
to do that in about 2 minutes, please.
very large question. So one of John Adams' most lasting legacies was his appointment of John Marshall as the Chief Justice, and he knew exactly what he was doing. He very intentionally selected a Federalist who was a more moderate Federalist, who was younger, who would stay on the bench for a very long time. I think they would have trouble understanding the current role of our Supreme Court, however, because they really did both view the system as one in which there were supposed to be three equal branches. And what has happened to a certain extent is the presidency has seized so much power in the last century, but I would say really since World War II. And the Supreme Court has seized so much power for itself. It has basically decided that it is the final arbiter of a lot of really important decisions. And Congress has kind of let them. And so Congress has become okay with being the second tier branch in which it is supposed to play a very key oversight role of both of the other branches, not just the executive branch. Congress is also supposed to check the Supreme Court. That part of the story often gets left out. I will say the one thing that I think John Adams and all of the other founding generation would agree upon, and typically when someone says the founders thought, that is a red flag that the thing they're about to say next is full of crock. With one key exception. The founders did not want a king. They did not want a king. They believed very strongly that the president was not, once they left the office, was not any different than any other citizen, and Adams demonstrated that conviction by leaving Washington, D.C. in a public coach. He did not take a private carriage home, and they believed that the president had to be held accountable under the rule of law. So that is the part, I think, of the current judicial system that they would be banging their head against the walls about, and would also be struggling to formulate a thought, as I am trying to do right now. Thank you. Hi.
How seriously should we take Alexander Hamilton's threats to use the new army in prosecution, like physical apprehension of Jefferson, or to move into Spanish Florida and other places that were not U.S. territory? Was this just Hamilton daydreaming, or should Adams have been seriously concerned about the use of the American military, the new army, for political purposes?
Thank you for that question.
You should know this is one of the America's premier military and national security experts, for those who
Corey
don't know.
Shockey just asked that question, and everything I know about the civil military divide, I pretty much know from her work. So, so I think that to a certain extent, Hamilton did have his head in the clouds, because I think that's how he lived a lot of the time. But I think he also, if given the opportunity, would have 100% done it. I think he definitely wanted to take, so I said earlier that the army had become quite political. Hamilton really wanted to use the army to march south to intimidate domestic enemies, and then to just seize a bunch of territory, because even if we weren't at war with France yet, we might eventually be, and we may as well seize this really valuable land. Adams was deeply distrusting of the military because it had become so political, and one of the big themes in the center of the book is his attempts to undermine its politicization. And he couldn't outwardly say he was against the army, because that would be really detrimental, but he found a lot of ways to slow play its expansion, to undermine Hamilton's role in it, and to try and push back. And his pursuit of diplomacy was one of the key ways in which he was trying to minimize the power of the army, because he understood as soon as it looked like diplomacy would work, then people would start deserting from the army and returning their commissions, and that is indeed what happened. So I think he shared the concerns you're mentioning and did everything in his power, which was admittedly limited at that point, to try and mitigate it.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. This has been great. As someone who's toured a lot of presidents' homes and burial spots, can you talk about what's unique about United First Parish Church in Quincy?
So for those of you who don't know, the Adams National Park Service site is an absolute treasure. It does not get as many visitors as it should, because it actually includes 3 presidential houses. It includes the house that John Adams was born, the house that John Quincy Adams was born, and then the house where they lived as adults, and the stone library that their successors built to honor them. And it is what library dreams are made of. I walked in and may or may not have started to cry. What makes the community amazing is that so many of the Adamses for so long lived in this region, and they had such a keen sense of history and their role in it. And so many of the Adamses are buried in this church. And so it is called the Church of the Presidents because so many of the Adams family are buried there. So I highly recommend. Quincy is not that far outside of Massachusetts. If you have the opportunity, definitely visit. It's an extraordinary place. Thank you. Yes.
It's the only place in America where 2 presidents and 2 first ladies are buried side by side.
See, it's delightful. You have to go. Summer plans for next year booked already for you.
Hi, my name is Evan Kilgore. I work for the Adams Memorial Foundation to get a memorial built. I just wanted to say thank you, first off. Thank you.
Are there
But I
checks
first want-
passing here?
I wanted to say thank you. Your book has been very valuable to our work, and I just wanted to start off with that. But secondly, I have to make a newsletter, and I read a lot about how Jefferson and Adams would bicker a lot to one another. Jefferson calling Adams a hermaphrodite. Adams will call him a low-level atheist and a radical, things like that. Are those at all in comparison to what we see now in politics, or was it much more toned down than that?
It's a great question. So they didn't actually call each other those things. Their supporters called each other those things. They were actually much more polite to one another than our candidates are often to each other today. So that is, I think, the key difference. And to be clear, they would say that John Adams had a hermaphroditic character, which meant that he did not have any principles for which he stood for. Hopefully, I've disabused you of that notion today. Politics was horrible at the time. It was super nasty. Just because they used different words didn't mean that they cut any less. So, for example, Adams often called Hamilton a puppy, which was the ultimate insult to masculinity at the time. And if Adams had not been the president, Hamilton would have challenged him to a duel. He kind of tried a couple times, and Adams ignored him. So the language was just as nasty. It just doesn't feel as nasty to us because that's a little bit distant. But the politics were awful and just as combative. And I think there are probably times where politics has been less awful, but 1790s was not one of them.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, I have a quick question. I hate to ask about Thomas Jefferson with this book.
Boo.
But you talk a little bit about how Jefferson obviously was undermining Adams, but then you also say he kind of bordered on treason. And I just wanted to see if you could kind of expand on that and what exactly was Jefferson doing that you think was treasonous, I guess.
Yes, absolutely. So Thomas Jefferson and John Adams had competed against one another in the 1796 election. And the way that the Constitution was drafted at the time, the top 2 candidates became president and vice president. That has since been fixed with the 12th Amendment, thank goodness, because obviously it's not a great idea to have 2 different people of 2 different parties in the executive branch. It does not work very well. And this was a demonstration by Jefferson of how poorly this design was thought out, because when John Adams first took office and was trying to figure out what to do with France, Thomas Jefferson met repeatedly with the French minister and said, don't sign a treaty with Adams. Wait 3 years and sign one with me and you'll get better terms. So what he was saying was, go ahead and keep seizing American ships. Go ahead and keep imprisoning American sailors. It's fine with me. I will give you a better deal in 3 years. He also encouraged France to invade England, which they obviously ignored as a suggestion. So he had some very interesting ideas about foreign policy. Now, under the technical terms of treason, you have to have a declared war. Because we did not have a declared war, it's not treason. But I think it comes very close to be so clearly interfering with the administration's policy and cavorting with the enemy while vice president. Not as a candidate, because we have seen that in many different election cycles, but as a vice president. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. So pursuing the theme that you spoke of earlier about Adams creating the traditions about peaceful transfer of power and so forth, talk a little bit, if you would, about the inauguration of Thomas Jefferson. Adams did not attend, Some have portrayed this as churlishness on his part. Do we need more context here? What's your view on this?
Thank you for this question. I love this question. So, the expectation, the pattern of a president who was defeated attending the inauguration of their successor was not established until 1845. There was no precedent of that at the state level either. And we've talked about how close the election of 1800 came to catastrophe, how close it came to violence. Now, there is no doubt that John Adams was bitter about losing. He didn't particularly enjoy losing. Does anyone enjoy losing? He didn't enjoy it. There was no doubt that he was mourning the loss of his son, Charles, who had recently died from alcoholism. But I also think that he had a real concern that his presence would be a distraction. It would continue this uncertainty. It would continue this question of, is this still a contested election? And he didn't want to do anything to take away from the smooth transition, to take away from the turning of the page that Jefferson was going to be able to enjoy. And critically, Jefferson did not invite him to go. Jefferson did not ask him to go. So I think that Adams genuinely didn't know if he wanted him there or if that would detract from this moment. So he left early on the morning of March 4th. As I said, he left in a public coach. Unfortunately for Adams, sitting across from him in this public coach was Theodore Sedgwick, who had become one of his chief antagonists in the Federalist Party. So that must have been a very uncomfortable coach ride. But I think you're right, that I do think that he is portrayed with our 21st century expectations, and that was really not the case in 1801. Thank you.
Well, this is great. Let me ask you one last question, and we're going to wrap it up. Can so tell us, if you can, I always like to hear from authors and historians, like, how did you do your research, and what was the most surprising thing you discovered about the material, and was there a question you tried to answer that you couldn't?
Yeah, so one of the great gifts to history are the edited collections of the presidents. There are a lot of the early presidents. There's an Adams Papers project, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Franklin, Hamilton, Jay. They're working on Monroe, and they are an unbelievable treasure. So that was a huge source for me. The Massachusetts Historical Society has pretty much everyone who's ever lived in Massachusetts, so that was also an incredible source. Theodore Sedgwick, who I just mentioned, has extraordinarily beautiful handwriting, and his letters have not been digitized, so that was incredible. And his letters really, I think, reveal a lot of Adams' political savvy, which was a find that I wasn't expecting. However, the question I was not able to ask, and it is driving me it will drive me crazy until the day I die. John Adams had a ceremonial sword. He purchased it when he first went to Paris in 1778. It was required for presentation at Versailles and the Court of St. James in London. He wore it in Paris, he wore it in London, he wore it at The Hague. Swords were typically given as gifts when someone died. They were passed down. They were very treasured heirlooms because they were expensive. The Adams family were hoarders. They did not get rid of stuff. I cannot find the sword. I don't know where it is. And it will drive me crazy until I find
like
it.
a movie with Nicolas Cage in it somewhere. Okay, thank you guys. It was really, really wonderful to be with you. Lindsay, you were fantastic. Really great. Brad's got to say a few words here.
You know, I also want to add, she didn't get to talk about it, but Mrs. Adams factors significantly in the book too, right? So it's another reason to buy the book, copies of which are available at the checkout desk up front.